Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Webinar Wednesday. Today's webinar is titled Informal Assessments in Adult General Education. Welcome again. I'm June Rawl. Today's webinar will focus on providing you with some strategies to best monitor student learning and progress. You will receive some various tools that you can utilize in your classroom to conduct informal assessments to further drive instruction. Today's facilitators are Vanessa Nicholson. Vanessa is from Orange County Public Schools, and she is the curriculum coordinator. Joining her today is Brian Bush, the Assistant Director at Atlantic Technical College in Broward County. So thank you for facilitating our webinar today. Well, let's cover a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Remember that if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A option that's on your screen. You just type it in there and hit the send button. All attendees' microphones are muted and you are in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is being recorded like all IPDAY trainings, and it will be available for access within 48 hours on the website. So now I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa and Brian to kick us off on this webinar. Vanessa, Brian?
Thank you, June, for that wonderful introduction. I just wanted to take a moment to go over the agenda that we have set out for you today. We're going to go over distance learning, engagement, monitoring, feedback, and then provide several informal assessment tools that you can utilize in your classroom. So Brian, I know that since this pandemic, things have changed so much. I mean, teaching is not exactly what it used to be. So how has teaching really changed since the pandemic of COVID-19?
Well, absolutely. And thank you for letting me join you today, and welcome to everybody. We hope we have some cool and interesting things to share with you and for you to learn from. I'm really excited because I just get to nerd out talking about teaching and learning and instruction. So to answer Vanessa's question and looking at this slide, well, I think it's important for us to frame today in the conversation. When we talk about how has teaching changed since COVID-19, really we're talking about the art and science of teaching and learning. So trying to approach this in a way that we're providing equity for our students. We're making sure that all students are learning, not just that we're standing up there and teaching, but that all of our students are learning. So what are the things that play into that with engagement, with assessment, with feedback, et cetera? So some of the things that have changed according to the pandemic are going to relate to how you have handled instruction in the past. If you're standing in the front of the classroom talking at your students and having big classroom discussions, then maybe it doesn't look vastly different in a virtual environment, but we're hoping that it does, and that it has created some additional challenges. Some of the things that our students are going through, obviously there's been job loss, there's been illness, there's been strife and anxiety that weighs over them on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes they're scared to come back and attend face-to-face classes. Sometimes we've got environments where there's some students in front of you, some students still at home. If I'm trying to teach a pronunciation, my students can no longer see my facial expressions because my mouth map is hidden behind the mask, and many other challenges. So, talking about that, what does it look like in your school? Because I know it looks different in all the counties in Florida. What are some of the examples of things that are going on that you've heard about?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with you, Brian. I mean, with the mask hiding the expressions, especially when you're doing phonemic awareness and phonics in the lower ABE and ESOL levels, it can become difficult for students to see the pronunciation. So it definitely has changed. In your question and answer, everybody should have access to a question and answer chat on their screen. Can you comment and let us know, how does it look for you? With the pandemic of COVID-19, how has it changed for you? Are you still doing distance learning? I mean, maybe you're not, maybe you're back face-to-face, but you are utilizing the mask and the 6 feet apart, making sure your students are at the distance they need to be. Maybe you're doing a hybrid version. Maybe you're teaching face-to-face, but then you have this technology where you are also projecting at home so students can see you virtually while you teach face-to-face. Maybe you're doing a little bit of both. So go ahead at this time in the question and answer, just put a comment of how it's looking for you. And with that being said, with distance learning, it's good to think about, like, how do we keep students still engaged? Because the traditional classroom is really not what it used to be, right? Students can't exactly get into groups very close. You can't have, like, these big group projects of 10 people gathered. I mean, it's really changed. So you have to think, how can we keep students still engaged with the distance learning? So I'm seeing the comments and they're great. It says all classes are still online for me, but I have colleagues who are working in a hybrid environment. Exactly. Another comment, 100% distance learning. Another comment that I'm seeing, using Blackboard Ultra Collaborate. That sounds really great. To meet with students online, 2 hours block, 4 days a week. And then I'm seeing a little bit of both for my students, but mostly it's face-to-face. So obviously there are a bunch of different methods of how we're teaching and engaging students with the distance learning and with the pandemic.
And what's interesting with this, Vanessa, is in adult ed, we've always been tasked with a very heavy lift of trying to personalize instruction for each and every individual student. And that looks vastly different depending on how many subjects, how many courses, how many levels you have in the classroom in front of you. And now we've added in these extra circumstances where I think most of the state is trying to allow students a choice. We see that some are still entirely remote, some are asynchronous, some are synchronous, some are blended. And when you're approaching it in that manner, it just gives you some additional things when you're trying to personalize your instruction, how you're going to reach each and every single one of the students. So just looking at the questions and comments that are coming in, I think the things that we're going to share today are going to very well align with some of the needs and concerns that you have out there. We see many comments that engagement has been a problem. So that is a big part of what we're talking about today. We're going to get into assessment. We're going to get into feedback, which is going to help us know if our students are learning. But obviously engagement is a prerequisite for that.
Of course it is. So Brian, how in the world do we keep students engaged still with COVID? And this is an excellent quote. Go ahead and take it away for us.
Well, student engagement is a necessary component in maintaining academic rigor and fostering active learning. And I think a lot of where we're going here today is, focusing on that learning part. We call ourselves teachers. That's what we do. We teach. But really, how do we know that our students are learning? And if I teach all day and nobody learned a thing, did I really teach all day? And so as we move forward talking about engagement, keep that in mind, that we're really trying to arm you with activities and strategies that are not only going to keep your students engaged, but allow you to find out informal, formative ways that if they're learning, so that you can come back and you can either enrich or remediate based on that data that you're collecting through these different variety of assessments. So great slide, great quote, really frames the rest of where we're going today, Vanessa.
And I couldn't agree more. So to keep students engaged, I think one of the first steps is to make a goal. Have students understand what they're learning and why they're learning, okay? Students cannot be engaged in something if they don't know what the goal is. Also, it's really important to make it relevant. When you are engaging students, let them know how it's going to apply to their lives, how it's going to apply to something they're doing. A lot of times our adult learners already come in with goals in mind, but if you sit down with them and understand what their goals are, you are able to keep them engaged. Benefits of keeping students engaged would be, of course, number one, learning, retention, because if they're engaged, they want to come to class, they want to be with their teacher, they want to learn, motivation, but also it helps you as a teacher foster a really good positive relationship with your students. So Brian, let us know, how can we keep students engaged virtually? I know in the traditional classroom, we can talk to them face to face, we can develop those positive relationships, we're seeing them, but virtually is a little bit more challenging. How can we do that?
It's interesting because my oldest is still engaged in virtual instruction. And it's hard even face-to-face to keep our students engaged sometimes. But if I posed you this question to our audience right now, just close your eyes or think back and reflect on your own education and think of that one teacher that you just loved going to their class. You couldn't wait to go to your class. And if you're open to sharing in the question area, we can talk about some of the answers, but just tell us what it was about that classroom and the activities in that classroom that that teacher was doing that kept you so engaged, that had you looking forward to going to that classroom. You know, some of the things that we can do in a virtual environment as you're sharing some of those things. And we've got some good tips here before I even get to our bullet points here. We have somebody that talks about opening with a review of what you did previously so you can celebrate your student success, opening with an encouraging quote or an upbeat song that's going to grab their attention. TED Talks are referenced. So that plays into exactly some of the examples that we shared, recorded videos, going on virtual field trips, looking at the third bullet point, PowerPoints, Prezi, Nearpod, and Flipgrid, you know, really getting away from the lecture period. As people start to talk about, you know, the things that they remember from their childhood, active participation in learning the material, you know, the teacher connecting things to daily life and mind-blowing ideas. I've never, and I've done this with students, I've done this with teachers, I've asked that question of administrators. Not once has anybody ever said, my teacher just gave the best lectures and I love sitting there and listening to them for 30 to 60 minutes at a clip. That's never been the engagement strategy for your students, no matter how mind-blowing and interesting your ideas that you're sharing are. That's just not the way that we're designed to engage in the learning process. So the PowerPoints, the Nearpods, the Flipgrids, not only are they visual, not only do they engage multiple learning styles, but they give our students opportunities to participate in the learning, respond in the learning, and engage that way. So online scavenger hunts are another way where you get your students doing something rather than being a passive learner. They're an active learner. And then you can see at the bottom, you know, using some of these other tools and the polls that are actually built into some of these web conferencing tools.
I couldn't agree more with you, Brian. Another effective strategy besides engagement is monitoring your students. Monitoring your students can be difficult virtually because, you know, in the traditional classroom, we're used to walking around and conducting observations and having those discussions. But even if we're in a pandemic or not in a pandemic, it's still important to monitor and to monitor your students. To utilize informal assessment, it's important for an educator to use monitoring techniques as a strategy. Monitoring students does not only help for you to know as a teacher that your students are engaged, but also how are you going to know if the students are understanding or comprehending the lesson you're giving them? If you're not monitoring, if you're not stopping to ask questions, to walk around, to have those discussions. Monitoring is a really important tool that leads to those informal assessments. So Brian, how do we monitor in a traditional setting versus a virtual setting?
Well, I'm really excited about where this is going because I've seen the rest of this PowerPoint. And Vanessa's going to share some ideas on how you can monitor your students. But, you know, one thing that we can't do is we can't judge how successful we're doing with our lessons and with our teaching based on the performance of the few high flyers or high participators in our class. I can't deliver a lesson and then determine the effectiveness of that lesson based on how the top 6 or top 7 students are doing and presume that anyone that didn't get the lesson, that they have to change something, they have to work harder, they have to pay more attention, they have to attend more regularly. We've really got to take ownership to the circumstance of each and every single one of our learners in the classroom. So that's why some of these monitoring strategies are important, because instead of judging our success rate as a teacher based on my highest performers, really it's probably just as efficient or more efficient to look at, you know, how I'm doing as a teacher based on the proficiency levels of my students in my classroom that really need the most supports. And one of the best ways I've ever heard it described is, you know, if you're going on a real field trip, you know, we're talking a lot about virtual field trips and you know, in class and out class and virtual monitoring. So let's go back to the time when we all got on a bus and we went on a field trip. And what's the most important thing when you're on a field trip? Making sure you don't lose anyone that's on the field trip with you. So how do you make sure? If the most important thing is not losing anybody, I'm going to count. And so I'm going to count everybody when they get on the bus. I'm going to count everybody at the rest stop. I'm going to count everybody when we get to our location. I'm going to count everybody when we get back on the bus to leave the location. So if the most important thing is making sure I have everybody, I go in that field trip and I've counted my students and the people that are on that bus 5, 6, 7 times throughout that day. And I really think that we as teachers and education professionals need to approach assessment and monitoring our students in the very same way. If making sure that my students are learning is the most important thing, I need to continuously and constantly provide informal formative assessments as we're working through these lessons. Much easier in person, right? I can just walk around, I can look at my students, I can look over their shoulders, I can listen to their conversations, and without giving them a quiz, I know if they're learning and they're responding in the right way. I can monitor the response rates. I can monitor who's participating and call on specific students and try and bring them out and engaged in the conversation or the activities. A little bit more difficult in a virtual environment. Sometimes we went from trying to get our class to settle down and stop talking so that they can listen to us. Now we're sitting in a virtual classroom in a Zoom meeting and we're saying, okay, please just anybody say something. So trying to get them to respond in the chat because they're reluctant to speak up in web conferencing software, giving them assignments where every single person in the classroom needs to respond so that you can look at their answers, trying to have virtual discussions, which could include breakout groups, and really just trying to elicit some response to the instructions so that and can monitor if they're learning along the way.
I agree, Brian. And one thing I want to mention is when we speak about prescriptions and software programs, I know that several, there's a bunch of counties out here that use different curriculum software, online pieces for your students. You can monitor the time spent within those programs and the prescriptions, the work and what they do. That's also a form of monitoring. Just like Brian said, I know monitoring can be hard virtually because some of our students are still missing the digital literacy component, right? So when they get on, they have a hard time, operating a computer. But if you just start with those basic digital literacy skills, you can get to the monitoring component. Another essential piece of effective teaching, which goes along right with informal assessment, is feedback. Feedback is so vital to our students because if we don't give feedback, how do they know if they're learning the materials that you're teaching? How do they know that they're on the right track if you're not giving feedback? And I love this quote. Feedback is considered as a vital approach to facilitate students' development as independent learners in order to monitor, evaluate, and regulate their own learning. So Brian, there's a few strategies that I think we should cover within feedback. Why don't you tell us a few?
Okay, great. Interestingly enough, as a learner, my preparation and my training as an education professional started when I was a student. Just self-disclosure out there, I earned my high school diploma by taking the GED test. I did not finish high school, I'm sure to the bane of many of my teachers. As we learn and evolve about life and our professions, we learn examples to follow. We learn non-examples that we're not going to follow. So some of the things that I experienced that made me a little disenfranchised and disengaged in school as a student, is for example, when I would get a worksheet that just had 30 mathematical equations on it, and I was supposed to work through those. Well, I'm sure oftentimes I worked through all 30 of those mathematical equations and I did them incorrectly. So in that instance, if I don't get timely and accurate and relevant and specific feedback to how I'm functioning and completing that worksheet, it's definitely all it's doing in that instance is teaching me how to do it incorrectly, and I'm not necessarily learning how to do whatever the instructional objective of the lesson is. So, really trying to look at this as it's not giving our students work that's giving them opportunities to practice is not beneficial unless we're actually giving them timely and relevant feedback. So I can't give you an assignment this week and not get around to giving you feedback 3 weeks from now. So when I would try and teach my students writing, it really didn't serve them to write a 5-paragraph essay, and then I would collect 100 of them, and it's going to take me a month to grade all of those because they're not getting timely feedback in that instance. So maybe it's more relevant for me to, give them, we're just going to work on an introductory paragraph, and I can get through those and I can give them timely feedback. I really like to look at feedback and imagine myself in a restaurant. Formative assessment versus summative assessment. If I'm not only giving you feedback, I also have to give you a multiple chance to be successful. So that basically, what's the difference between the chef tasting the soup and the customer tasting the soup. If I'm the chef and the soup doesn't taste quite right, if I'm the teacher and my students aren't quite getting it, as long as they know that they're going to get multiple chances to prove that they're successful, to prove that they're learning, I can tweak, I can remediate, I can enrich, I can do more things to help my lesson. If I'm doing that in the kitchen at a restaurant, I can tweak, I can change the soup before I deliver it to the customer. If you're never going to give them another chance to test or to do an assessment or to prove that they've learned the objectives of the lesson, they're not going to listen to the feedback because they knew they only had that one shot to prove themselves. It's very similar to the customer getting the soup and, hey, it's too salty, or hey, it's cold. Well, it's too late. The customer already has it and you can't do anything about it. That's much the same way that students feel about feedback. If you're not using it to give them another chance to be successful, it really loses the weight and value of students taking it in and using it reflectively.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, Brian. I mean, feedback definitely should be timely, accurate, and give them next steps. But also, I want to point out that sometimes when students are in a cognitively complex task, it is okay to delay feedback. I know as teachers, even me, when I was teaching, I would make the mistake and just want to quickly, tell them the answer, quickly say, okay, the answer is this. It's okay for them to have some deeper thinking, use those critical thinking skills, and be able to complete an assignment. So it's okay at times to delay the feedback. So another thing about feedback that's really important, and I've also made this mistake early on in my teaching career, I'd have to catch myself, is if a student is answering a question correctly, they're doing, a really good job on assignment, don't make it personal. Don't just say, wow, you're so smart. This is so great. That's not really helpful feedback. You're so smart, you're intelligent, you're awesome. Yeah, those are really great compliments, but that's not good feedback. Feedback should address performance on a task. It should, address what they are doing and what they need to work towards for improvement. So try not to make feedback so personal of just talking about how smart they are. Don't you think that's like a good thing to do, Brian?
Yeah, excellent point. Making it as specific as possible, because otherwise generic compliments, and we try and be complimentary. We want to be encouraging. We want them to feel positively about their participation and their engagement. But, instead of saying good job, good job doing what? Good job with what?
Right.
And being specific, related to the task or related to your objectives of that particular lesson. Excellent points.
Agreed. Now, feedback can be general or individualized. And I know Brian's going to go into a little bit of detail to explain to you how you can give general feedback for a classroom and then individualized feedback for a student. So Brian, explain to our audience how to give general and individualized feedback.
So an interesting way to strategically approach feedback that allows students to, you really want them to feel comfortable. If you're not making mistakes, you're not learning. So we really want them to understand that it's a trusting environment, that the feedback is going to come in a way that's not going to embarrass them, so sometimes you're going to do that strategically for the whole class, where they understand the goals of the lesson, they know what proficiency and success is going to look like. And sometimes, whether this is you've got them in separate groups and one group is off track and you want to get them back on track, you can complement another group. So rather than negative feedback to the group that's not doing what you want, you can give the positive feedback of, okay, I really like how this is occurring over here with this group, where they're talking about the specifics of the assignment, or you can do that for the whole class, just to give positive reinforcement when they are doing the things that you're hoping for them to do. When you're giving individual feedback, it's got to be in the right setting. You've got to be able to deliver it in a way that is received well by the student, and choosing the right moment. You certainly want to be careful, which is an additional challenge in the virtual environment right now, because you don't have as many opportunities to quote unquote pull a student to the side, because we're all in the same, if you're conducting synchronous learning right now, we're all generally in the same meeting space at the same time. So delivering that feedback in a way where the student doesn't feel like they're being embarrassed, or that they've, they got it wrong and they're worried about what everybody else is going to think, because we want to continue to encourage their engagement and their participation. And if they feel like it's going to be embarrassing when they get it wrong, just try and minimize those things. And the final point is, allowing equal opportunity. There's certain instances where we're reluctant to call on students because they're shy or for a variety of reasons, but we certainly don't want the same 2 or 3 to dominate the entirety of options to participate. We want to draw those other students in, the reluctant participants, and provide activities or protocols that allow them to participate and receive feedback, just like the ones that are eager to answer every single time you answer a question.
Perfect, and I agree. Within feedback, and one of the most important components of feedback is data analysis. Now, I know that adult education, and there's a lot of movement, and you have students coming in and out, and they're taking the TABE, the CASAS test for ESOL or CASAS goals, or whatever assessment you use in your district. It's really important to know where your students are at. When they come in, know where they tested at, know their goals, know where they want to go, and set those goals for them. Sit down and conference with them. Okay, by the time you test again on this test, that's 50 hours or 70 to 100 hours. I want you to be here. Let's see if we can create that goal. Conference with your students. Also, you can also create a data sheet. I know data sheets are time consuming, but it gives you a snapshot of where that student is. A data sheet can have, the student's name, their student number. It could have, their goals, maybe where they want to go. Maybe when they're coming out of ABE, their goal is to get their GED. Maybe when they're coming out of their GED, their goal is to go to CT, career and technical education. Have their skill score also written on the data sheet. Within their skill score, have how many points it is to the next level, to the next gain, like +7 till I get to level 5, +3 till I get to level 2. Have that goal there with him. Show students their data. Let them be responsible for their own data. Have these conversations, because feedback is really important when conducting data analysis.
Excellent points. On all of those things are going to bring back to the student getting this psychological positive feedback that you believe in them, they can be successful. They need to implement these things so that when it comes around again and their next opportunity for success, then their next opportunity to prove that they've learned it, if you implement these things that we're talking about, it's going to get you to that next level. We got a great comment in the question areas here where, using the students to provide feedback to one another as well. The only source of learning and feedback is not the instructor in the classroom, but, giving them a chance to think critically about the assignment, to compare their work to other students' work. And I know we're going to get into that here in a minute, where we start talking about self-assessment of where we are. And that's a great opportunity to allow that strategy to take place with the students, where they're looking at each other's work and giving each other feedback and constructive criticism and positive feedback based on what they've done and been able to demonstrate their learning as.
Absolutely. Now we're going to move on to informal assessments. And Brian, why don't you explain what informal assessments are to our audience?
So informal assessments are assessments that are given sometimes spontaneously or on the spot to gather more information about where students are at in a particular lesson or skill. We're going to get into some examples, but I think most of our audience understands this does not mean it is a test or a quiz or sending them to take TABE. That is not the only type of assessment that should be ongoing.
Agreed. Informal assessments are definitely on the spot and they're spontaneous, and usually it's a quick assessment just to determine where your students are at. So our first example are as exit slips, or some people like to call these exit tickets. And there's 2 different types. But the first type we're going to go over is an exit slip that shows or demonstrates knowledge of what you've been teaching. So I created an example here. I said you've been teaching number patterns to ABE students, and your question can be, what number comes next in this number pattern? And this can be on a little piece of paper. You can already type it up in advance, knowing that you're teaching that lesson, have it printed out for students, and they would have to answer the next pattern that's coming. And this pattern is going by 9, so they would have to answer the next number in sequence. If it's just on the spot, you can just have students answer that question for you on a piece of paper and submit it. And you can look at it with their name on it, and you could just check it real quick. Okay, Johnny got this, Susie didn't get this answer. She may need more small group instruction. She may need to be taught this lesson again because she did not get it. So an exit slip is a really good way, or exit ticket in this format is a really good way of monitoring your students, but also providing an informal assessment.
Absolutely. Excellent point, Vanessa. Some other things that we can ask for on these exit slips or exit tickets. It doesn't always have to be in the fill in the blank. We can really give them an opportunity to share how they're thinking, based on, we've already told them what success looks like on our particular learning objective or our goal for this lesson. So we want to know what you learned through today's lesson. What was new learning for you? Give us an example of how this may be applicable in the world, or however you want to put it out there. And then really important, I still don't understand. And sometimes, we don't know what we don't know, but when a student can actually verbalize or articulate those challenge points for them, that really gives you a quick win as a teacher, because it's going to give you some specific information on when you come back to remediate, based on what you're getting from a majority of the class, what you've been able to implement successfully, and those things that they still don't understand. And the beauty of exit tickets is you're going to get one from every single student. So no longer are you worried about, determining how my lesson effectiveness in teaching today was, because I've got the same 6 students that want to dominate all the answers. Well, no, in this instance, I got feedback from every single student, even the ones that were scared to speak up and share in front of the class. I can quickly hand you an exit ticket on the way out. And I've been able to articulate and communicate my thoughts with you, and you can gauge how I'm learning, even though I didn't participate in that whole group discussion or whatever the activity was, with fidelity as you may have envisioned, but you're still getting that assessment quickly taken care of for those students.
Correct. And this helps with monitoring. You're right, Brian. This helps to monitor the entire class versus a few students. Another informal assessment that you can use is a checklist. And I know you're thinking, oh my goodness, I have multiple levels. There's no way I can do a checklist. But yes, you can. You can absolutely do a checklist. And a checklist can be on a clipboard, something this simple. If you have these 5 students that are on this ABE or ESOL level, or you're teaching a certain skill, have their names written down on the list, and then just write notes. Did they get this skill? Did they not get this skill? When we're teaching, sometimes we have students work independently. Sometimes we have students work in groups. As they're working in groups, you can quickly walk around by listening to the interactions, or just asking them a question and seeing if they're able to produce the right answer. That's a quick, easy way not only to monitor, but to also have an informal assessment of which student needs more help. And obviously, if a student is not understanding, the information or providing the right answer, when you are providing or giving a checklist, you should write a note and say, hey, student A needs more support in this area. What can I do to support them further along so that they can move on to the next level? So checklists, it's really a good way. I actually enjoy using checklists. I really love using it. That's one of my favorite tools in informal assessments. As Brian and I are sharing informal assessments that you can use, if you have any that you use in your classroom, go ahead and type them in the question and answer so we can see what you're also using in your different counties.
Very timely, Vanessa. We have a couple of responses here where,
Sure.
where someone talks about hanging a chart on the wall in the classroom, and as students complete particular objectives or standards, that they will then get check marks and work through a list of different objectives or standards that they're working on in the class. So it serves as a quick check for the teacher, because the teacher can look at that chart and see how proficient the class has been based on the check marks or not. And I'm sure that's tapping into some of those OCD tendencies in human nature that I certainly possess, of where if I have a list of things that I need to go get check marks for, I'm going to pay particular attention when we're on a lesson for one of those standards or topics or goals that I haven't checked off yet. So I'm going to go ahead and perk up and pay attention and make sure that I can get that check mark and share it and assess that way, where not only is it available to the teacher to see, but all the students, and it serves as a celebration of success too. So thank you for sharing that, audience.
Absolutely. That's such a great comment. Now, Brian, why don't we talk about the collaborate board, another one of my favorite informal assessments?
Yeah, Collaborate board is really, really cool because, you know, in person, I think we would do this. We would pass out a bunch of sticky notes. We would ask for feedback and students would feel very safe and secure writing down their answer anonymously and going and slapping it on the board there. And then we have all the answers collectively to go over. That's one of the things that is translated very well in a virtual environment where there are tools and software platforms out there that allow you to post a Collaborate board where students can collaborate, they can communicate together, or they can participate individually. That's been a long-standing strategy, and I think those type of things, trying to transfer them into the virtual environment, has been the challenge for many of us because we don't know what tools to go ahead and create those things. But when you had referenced earlier the PowerPoint, you know, having students work together on that PowerPoint the same way they would a Collaborate board may be the substitute for when you were in class and you had a poster creation. And some teachers that I've worked with before have been reluctant to ask their students to do things like a poster creation. But we know that effective instructional practice is the same at all levels. And certainly those type of things where we are making our students become active participants instead of passive listeners will always get a little bit more retention of the learning objectives for those things. So excellent point. Collaborate board's definitely one of my favorites.
Absolutely. Now we're going to share some virtual Collaborate boards that you can use in your classroom. Now, I know some of you may already use some of these, but I mean, I love all these virtual Collaborate boards. My favorite one is Nearpod. I love using that program, but there's iBrainstorm, Padlet. You can collaborate on Google Docs, Nearpod, and then Flipgrid. It's more of like a video Collaborate board. So this screenshot is from Nearpod. I just created a question and I actually typed up the answer, but usually you would see a bunch of answers on here, like little sticky notes. If you look at the yellow part being the poster board and the white rectangle being more of a sticky note, you would see several of these up here. And the great thing is on the white sticky note, you'll see a little heart. Students who agree with that statement can select or click on that heart. So, I mean, it's a really great way for students to collaborate. If you are familiar with Flipgrid, students can create videos, video responses to a question that a teacher asked, and then you can see all the videos and it collaborates. It's really a great program as well, and it's free. So if you're not familiar with any of these programs, please explore them. I mean, they're really great ways to collaborate.
Some of the comments in the chat include Google Slides, which I presume relates to Google Docs. I'm not real familiar with that one. We have Outlook accounts in my district for our students, so we were able to share platforms.
Google Slides is familiar to like a PowerPoint, Brian.
Excellent, and that's what I presume. So great ways to get them working together, and this really serves as an excellent intervention for some of the students that need additional supports, because now not only am I going to be able to participate and add what I think about this question or this topic, but I can view the other students in the class and see their answers, which is going to serve as another way for me to interact with that content and just kind of deepen my understanding. If I needed some interventions, if I needed a few additional supports, being able to see everybody's answers is going to help me formulate my thoughts and my understanding of the topic. So it really works on a couple different levels.
It does. Now, Brian, how can we conduct an informal assessment using chat discussions with all these virtual platforms and web conferencing tools that we have to use now? How can we do that?
Well, you know, just like what's going on here, when we ask our audience, and I know you can't see each other's responses, but we're trying to share as many as we can. It gives us an idea of if we're saying things that make sense, or, you know, if your responses are off target. So just another way, especially now where students aren't engaged in a face-to-face environment for a large part, we can just get them engaged, going through these chat discussions, giving them inquiries. And we don't always have, it doesn't always have to be, you know, I pose a question and students answer their individual responses to that question. Sometimes we can release this to them and we can have them lead the chat discussions and they're posing questions, and you have, you know, question asking group, question answering groups, and then you can you can have them work collectively in a breakout room and create questions that they're going to come back and bring to the chat. And just really getting those opportunities where you kind of release your ownership of the content and the learning, and pass that off and make it their responsibility as active learners. I think the chat is an excellent way to do that, and not by, a simple close-ended question where they're able to respond in 1 or 2 words, but really just releasing and allowing them to open it up, and gives them an opportunity to write and articulate some of their ideas in a more engaged, connected manner.
Couldn't agree more. Now, questioning is one of probably the most traditionally used informal assessment. We as teachers are always asking students questions, pausing and stopping to see if they are retaining and understanding the information. So it's important to ask or generate questions that require an appropriate answer or response. I'll share with you, when I first started teaching back in the dinosaur ages, I would ask questions, but I would not give my students a chance to answer. Meaning, I would ask a question like, what is blue? What is red? What is, I would just multiple questions at one time. That does not allow students to take time to think or allow for deeper critical thinking. When you are doing questioning for an informal assessment, wait, give them some time to think or formulate their answer. Try not to call on the same students all the time. I mean, it can be a habit, okay, well, so-and-so knows the answer, so let me just call on them because at least I know the answer is going to be right. And, I'm definitely going to call on them if somebody else is in my room because I know they're going to have the right answer. Because if they have the wrong answer, what am I going to do? Well, as a teacher, you should already prepare and have the misconceptions written down. In your lesson, think about, okay, a student may not get this. There may be a misconception about this. How can I address or formulate or support them further? So in questioning, go ahead and think about the misconceptions and also allow wait time for students. Give them time to think and develop their answers. I know it's really hard to wait when seconds are rolling by and you're hearing nothing but dead silence. It's like, oh my goodness, I just need to call on the next person. But wait, if you give them a chance, a lot of times they formulate a really great response. Now, Brian, let's talk more about wait time. Why is wait time so important?
Well, I agree, and just like you, when I first started teaching, I prepared effortlessly, and it was just put so much into it that I really just thought I was crushing it, and I was just amazing. And it's funny because every year I learn how much better I could have done certain things, and I think my students were always learning, and I always had their best intentions at heart. But wait time is one that sometimes we let students quote unquote off the hook because it's uncomfortable, sitting there and letting that pause, that think time linger in the air, but it's uncomfortable for everyone. So go ahead and give that opportunity, give that chance. I think we have a few things within this questioning, and we have an audience comment that they've been piloting what they call pack back questions, and it's a Socratic questioning tool where the students can ask all the questions, and you kind of step back as the teacher and you help facilitate that process. So I'm sure part of that would also include, letting our students know the same thing. If they're in charge of all the questioning, that they should be allowing that think time as well. One mistake that I used to make was when I was going to ask a question, you really want to avoid calling a student's name, because as soon as I say Chris, and then ask the question, well, the other 25 students in my classroom all know that they're off the hook. They don't formulate an answer to the question ahead of time. So one strategy that I've seen implemented in some teachers' classrooms that I've observed is they will just ask the question, allow the think and wait time before they even call on a student. So, ask the question, get in the habit of, I want you all thinking of your answer of this question, allowing that 3, 4, 5 seconds for them to think before you even contemplate who you're going to call on. And Vanessa has some strategies here coming up about some of the different ways that you can determine who you're going to call on. But all of those little strategies are going to make a big difference in making sure they're engaged, because they've got to come up with an answer because they don't know who you're going to call on next. Making sure, I always talk, and here's another thing when we're dealing with adult students, sometimes we're reluctant to ask them to raise their hands. Our college experience and our classroom environments when we were learners was, you get to a point where you just participate in a discussion, in an adult manner or mature manner, and you wait till someone else is done speaking and then you chime in. But I always try to explain to my students and get them in the habit of, raising your hand and the process of raising your hand. And when you lower your hand gives me a lot of information as your teacher, because, as I call on one student and they're answering, if your hand goes down, that means that you share the same answer as them. So I'm learning who's learning in my classroom simultaneously based on that. Whereas if that other student answers and your hand goes up, well, that means that you have a difference of opinion and a different answer from them. So paying attention and getting your students to participate in some of those traditional experiences that you might have in a classroom can elicit a little bit more. You talk about informal assessments. Who would really think that the process of asking questions to my class and what they do with the hand raising and hand lowering actually gives you some assessment information as you go through that. So, the process of asking questions, allowing wait time, watching your students' reactions and how they interact with each other certainly gives you that information. And guess what? In a virtual environment, if you teach them how to use the tools, if you teach them how to raise and lower their hands, you can replicate those exact same things. They just look a little bit different. Then they take a little bit more practice and repetition, but you can certainly get there with some of those deals.
Absolutely. Now, in order to help you with wait time and help you choose, a distributed amount of students, and I have a habit of doing this as well when I was teaching, I would call on the same students all the time. Well, I would typically call on the students that had their hand raised. I probably didn't call in my early years of teaching students that had their hand down because I figured they didn't want to be called out, but that is not helping them learn. That's not having them participate. That's not you monitoring, and that's not giving good feedback. So to encourage participation and hope of discussions, I recommend using popsicle sticks. And I've had to do this just to prevent myself from calling on the same student over and over and over again. You can write everybody's name down, put it in a bucket, and then just pick it out. And usually students, they're more alert because they don't know if their name's going to be called next. If you don't like the idea of popsicle sticks, write everybody's name on a piece of paper, throw it in a bucket again, same thing, and just pull their name out. Again, students become a lot more alert because they're thinking, is she going to call me next? And am I going to be the next one call? I better be paying attention because she's not going to call on this student all the time anymore. So that will help you to avoid calling on the same students over and over. And I know it's hard in the beginning because, this person probably has the right answer. They're waving and raising their hand, but you are not allowing other students to participate or other students to produce an appropriate answer as well.
And Vanessa, on that point, I love that strategy too. And I often use the popsicle sticks, not only because it meant I got to eat a lot of popsicles to get to the sticks. But no, that's a joke. They have them at Walmart for a couple bucks. You can get 500 of them. But I like the fact that, if I pulled a popsicle stick and the name was Gabby and Gabby was forced to answer, there would be some days where I would set Gabby's stick to the side so that I could try and work through all of the students, and I would just keep going through the learning process until I was out of popsicle sticks, meaning everybody got a chance to participate. And there were other days where your popsicle stick would go back into the mix, because what I don't want to happen is I don't want a student to think, oh, I already answered, my sticks to the side and I'm not going to get called on again. So we want to keep them, find as many different practices where they don't get bored. It's something new, but it also keeps them on their toes where they have to be engaged every single time you ask a question, because they don't know when you're going to call on them and when you're not going to call on them, because you've implemented different practices and different classroom protocols that's going to keep them on their toes, increase engagement, increase assessment, and increase opportunities for them to get feedback from you and from their classmates.
Agreed. Now, Brian, this informal assessment I really, really like. Can you tell us more about a self-assessment? How does a student conduct a self-assessment?
Well, certainly the absolute best way to have ongoing assessment, where you can really identify who feels like they're doing well in progression of the standard, who's performing below standard, who's approaching the standard, who's performing proficiently on the standard, and who's exceeding the standard. Well, first of all, it defines for the student what success should look like. They cannot self-assess unless they know what tasks or what knowledge they should have or be able to perform in order to demonstrate success on that lesson objective. So even just that information right off the bat gets you way ahead on all of your lessons. And really, when I started doing that, when I was teaching, helped me plan more effectively because I had a more tangible target for our students. So just having them reflect, having them communicate that, and there's a variety of different ways that you could do this. I've seen people do this, like with the 1, 2, 3, 4, raising their fingers. They would have ratings on their desks, just really having them reflect, and at what level am I performing right now? Because, that helps also get them to understand how to advocate for themselves, how to seek answers. And then for you, in your approach and practice to student grouping or student teaching or interventions applied, if I have somebody that's performing above standard or that needs enrichment, I can implement a few additional strategies this way. So just a basic thing that you should be, doing with Fidelity, that it gets done often in person, face to face, but also should be used and not forgotten in the virtual environment.
Agreed, Brian.
And fist to 5 was one of the strategies that was shared in the chat, and certainly a good way to do it. Show me a fist to 5, and you quickly assess and get feedback. But they don't have time to look around the room quite so much, so they're not worried about being
Right.
called out or being embarrassed.
No, I agree. And then some other methods that students can do if they're using a 5-point scale or 4-point scale is if you give them an assignment on their paper, they can write a 1, 2, 3, 4 in the corner of their paper. Also, they don't have to put their hands in the air. I've seen some teachers where they just kind of put, the rating 1, 2, 3, 4 close to their heart. So students don't have to see, hey, you're a 1 or you're a 2. Some students feel more embarrassed or, more conscientious about that. So there's different ways to conduct that self-assessment. That's really great information, Brian, and I love fist to 5. Our last, let's see, here we go. Our last informal assessment, one of my favorites, I think they're all my favorites really, are games. I love playing games in the classroom. Absolutely love games. Who doesn't? Even adults, you would think, adult students don't love games. Yes, they do. They absolutely love games. One of my favorites is Kahoot. Kahoot is fun. They love playing it. They love logging in. They love looking at, the board to see if they're answering the questions correctly. This is an effective way to also monitor. This is also a good way to have students engage, but it's also a great informal assessment. One of the new things about Kahoot now is after the students play the game, you can give them the link and they can continue practicing those skills even afterwards. So that's one of the new things Kahoot has added. So students really love Kahoot. There's Quizlet, and Quizlet's a wonderful game that students can play. You can put it on the smartboard. They could download it on their app if they have a phone. You could put it on their computers. Students really enjoy those games. Teacher created games. Like, I know you might think like students don't want to get up and move around and go to this corner or that corner, but as adults, yeah, they do. They love those games. Challenge your students. Have them create games. You would be surprised of what wonderful game ideas that students really come up with. If you have a whiteboard or smartboard, use that as a game. A lot of times on your smartboard, you can download certain apps, you can download certain links, and it will have the game created on the smartboard where students can use the actual smartboard pen to facilitate or conduct a game. Brian, do you have anything to add there?
I think it's alarming how competitive our students are. So when you start playing a game, if they were starting to get disengaged or weren't with you, obviously, if you can incorporate the lesson objectives, it works as assessment, it works as engagement, it makes it more fun, and everybody's going to perk up. So some of them you have to break them up afterwards because they're so competitive.
No, I agree. I see a question. Can you put a Kahoot game in Canvas? I'm not sure. I think you could probably put the link in Canvas. I'm not really sure. That's something you have to look into, or maybe you can put the Kahoot site on the course navigation on the left. I'm not really sure though if you can actually, put more than the link within like your Canvas course within like a page. So
Yeah,
that I'm not sure of.
I'll jump in here because you actually can, and that's some of the advancements. Kahoot's one of the ones that's really done well responding, because we used to have to all log in and take the quiz live. For those of you that are teaching asynchronous classes right now, this is an absolute great tool, because one student can take this quiz at 2 a.m. and depending on how many they get right and how fast they answer, and another student takes it at 6 p.m. the next day, it's going to compile all of those results as if we all took the quiz live together, and you're still going to have a score, you're still going to have results. So it's actually a really cool, good tool that's responded well and developed through this whole process.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Brian. Well, I wanted to leave everyone with some resources of where we got all our information from. These are great resources. Do you want to look up any to find further information on monitoring, feedback, engagement strategies, and informal assessments? So right now we're going to go
as
ahead,
we
Brian.
get into the question and answer session, there is a comment, going back to the questioning techniques before, that also you can give your students question stems that would help guide them to, work as an intervention for them too, such as give an example of how today's assignment makes things easier for you, and then it kind of leads them to giving you a little bit more feedback on how they're doing, and then you can therefore turn that around as an intervention and give them feedback. But certainly want to open the floor to any other questions that the audience may have at this time.
Questions or comments? We'll give you a minute or two. I think we were answering them as we go, but if we missed any.
We have one. How long is an appropriate wait time maximum to give students?
So wait time varies. I've seen it be anywhere from 15 seconds, which is like a really long time, right, to 3 to 5 seconds. So for me, I probably, and Brian, you can answer on this, I probably would not give wait time any more than 10 seconds. That's just me, but I've seen research on 15 seconds, but anywhere from 3 to 5 seconds.
Yeah, I would agree. If you're getting into a time where it feels a little bit awkward, then you're probably in the sweet spot. It probably is just right. But any beyond where it's starting to feel awkward, go ahead and try and let the students save their dignity and start to seek help. And does anybody else have anything to add, or does anyone else have some insight to help so-and-so out? But yeah, I think, it certainly can exceed that. But I think based on the research and what you said, Vanessa, is spot on.
Perfect. So now I'm going to turn it over to June Rawl. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We appreciate it.
Wow, thank you so much, Vanessa and Brian. There's a lot of things that we could take away from this. Your feedback matters to us. So if you would just answer these 3 short questions, we would really appreciate it and would love to hear how you felt about this webinar today. While you're doing that, I'll just remind you that next Wednesday, March 10th, our webinar is Administrative Best Practices for Monitoring Virtual Courses. So I really hope all of you can join us next Wednesday, March 10th, and we'll have another Webinar Wednesday. Thank you so much. Stay safe.